Working class voters.
Working class white voters.
The word working class.
With working class voters.
Working class Latino voters.
And by the way, also working class.
Working class African American males.
Working class voters.
Working class voters.
Working class voters.
Working class.
Working class.
We spent our first 3 episodes before the election focused on working class voters. Since the election, there has been no shortage of commentary about this majority of the electorate. But what's harder to find are working class politicians. Who are they? Where are they? They're hard to find because only 1.6% of politicians are considered working class. In this episode, we'll talk to 2 working class candidates who defied expectations by running for Wisconsin State Assembly. We discuss how the people representing you probably didn't plan to, the singular thing that could transform politics, and money, money, money. But first, I'll speak with an expert to help us get a lay of the land. This is Shifting Terrain. I'm Rachel Rybaczuk, a working class sociologist and organizer. I've spent a long time thinking about race and class, most recently in politics. I'm speaking with Eric Hansen, Associate Professor of Political Science at Loyola University, Chicago. Hi, Eric. Welcome to Shifting Terrain.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Can you give us a basic overview of your research and what you learned?
Yeah, so I've been studying the composition of working class legislators at the state level, along with Nicholas Carnes, who's a professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. We've been, for the last couple of terms, since 2021, tracking what percentage of state legislators had jobs in the working class immediately before they were elected to the state legislature. And what we found is a very small percentage of legislators come from the working class, roughly 1.6%.
Before digging into the results and some of the data of your research, what inspired you and your colleagues to focus on this?
What's interesting about it to me is just how much of a mismatch there is between our elected representatives and the rest of the population, and how few people seem to be aware of this. At one level, people are aware. I think there's a general sense that politicians are out of touch, that they don't understand the needs of everyday Americans, but it doesn't necessarily get filtered through a specific class lens. So what interests me is both that continued mismatch, but also just the seeming intransigence of the problem. It seems like a lot of the reasons why the working class is so underrepresented are structural, just things we take for granted in our electoral process. It would take a lot to move those pieces of the puzzle around.
In an article about your research, you say this is a bipartisan issue because it's true for Republicans and Democrats. And I noticed with more Democrats being identified as working class. Do you have an explanation for why more Democrats ended up in the category of working class politician?
Yeah. So I think this is somewhat of a historical legacy of the closer connections to the Democratic Party among working class folks, labor unions, organizers. I should say that's quickly changing with the new Trump coalition emerging in the Republican Party. Now, you're right that in our data, we do observe more Democrats than Republicans. I think it's about 2% of all Democrats are working class, whereas only 1% of all Republicans are working class. That's still a very small number in both parties.
It is.
So to the extent that there is more of that, maybe a weight on the Democratic side, I suspect that might be from politicians who were elected 10, 20 years ago, remaining in office in the states. And I think we're seeing more and more working class folks run for office in both parties. Separate from this data collection about state legislators, I have a separate paper where a co-author and I surveyed the primary candidates for Congress between 2008 and 2016. And we found a roughly even split there too.
Interesting. I actually was going to ask about the focus, at least the research that I initially saw. Your research focuses on state legislatures. Why only state legislatures?
Yeah. So we focus on state legislators in part because we can't find working class legislators. One of the main reasons that we don't see many working class legislators is the amount of money it takes to run for office. There are other reasons too, and I'm happy to go into those. But when we think about the amount of money it takes to run for a seat in Congress versus the amount of money it takes to run for even a Senate seat in California versus what it takes to run for the House in New Hampshire, where you're representing 3,000 people and you can knock on a lot of those doors and meet those people personally. Just the amount of resources are very different. And so we're better able to observe some variation, count working class legislators, simply because it's an easier entry point for people from diverse economic backgrounds than Congress is.
When you referred to the differences in spending to run for office, can you put some numbers on that?
When I look up these numbers, when I'm teaching in class, I usually go to Follow the Money, which is a nonprofit group that tracks congressional campaign fundraising. I think it's over $1 million is what you need to raise for the average House seat. Senate, it depends how big the state it is that you're running in. And a lot of that money is fundraised from other groups. Candidates don't necessarily spend all that out of their pocket. At the same time, when groups are recruiting candidates, they're often looking for candidates who can support themselves financially while they're campaigning, that don't have to work an hourly job just to put food on the table and can use that free time and resources to go out and knock on doors or appear at fundraisers. Plus, if you're trying to talk to donors, it's easiest to get money from people you already know. And so if you're segregated into class networks, working class candidates might not know rich people that they can ask for money to raise that $1 million to run for Congress.
Sure. And then I think, though, we hear of these breakthrough success stories of candidates who don't take big donations. You know, it's $5 here and just this groundswell of small amounts supporting somebody. Is that something you've paid attention to? And how successful can somebody be with a strategy like that relative to the kinds of amounts you're talking people need to raise?
Yeah, totally. I think that when we think about candidates who have been successful at doing that, they're already high profile on a state or especially national stage, which means that they've already gone through a primary process and won that. They've already gotten some support from party insiders, from groups that are able to set up these fundraising apparatuses. So those candidates that we see able to compete on the grassroots level have already run the gauntlet to get to that point. Where especially working class candidates get weeded out is that gauntlet where you're trying to win the primary, where you're trying to, defeat a well-funded lawyer, for instance, in your home district. And if you're just starting up, it can be pretty difficult to convince people you've never met online to give $5 to your campaign. That's much later in the process.
Are there other barriers that you've identified and can speak to about the challenges for working class people?
So one barrier I can also talk about is how people are recruited. So a lot of candidates don't just wake up one day and decide, I'm going to run for office. I don't want to say no one does that because we have some obvious examples. But a lot of the people that we see...
Wait, who are the obvious examples?
Who are the obvious examples?
AOC, Jamal Bowman.
Well, and even AOC, she bartended before she ran for office. But before she bartended, she was working on campaigns. She was involved in professional political circles as a career. So I guess I don't want to cite a specific example. And
Sure.
Surely, even if someone was recruited, there's a pretty strong incentive for that candidate to say, you know what, I was inspired by X issue to run for office. My main point here is that people are often recruited by professionals to run for office. They're either professional candidate recruiters that work for firms, but they could also be recruited by county party officials, existing office holders. So basically the establishment in their community are often the people that try to think, okay, who would be a good person to run for this office that we know is going to come vacant? And often the first thing that those people do is think of the people they already know. And so if you have a bunch of white collar professionals holding these offices, they're probably going to think first of people in their professional networks and their social networks who are not themselves working class. So there's a Rolodex problem when it comes to recruiting working class candidates. One thing that the evidence has been pretty clear about so far is that there doesn't seem to be any intrinsic voter bias against working class candidates. So given the choice, voters are pretty open to working class candidates. It's just they're not given the choice very often.
Well, I was able to find 2 candidates in Wisconsin whose campaigns were made possible, in part, because of a major shift in voting maps that expanded the opportunity for newcomers to politics. Here's my conversation with William Walter, recent candidate of the 24th Assembly District of Wisconsin, where state assembly is what other states refer to as the state legislature. So, did you wake up one day and think, I'm going to run for political office?
No, not exactly. My state senator was elected in 1991. I was born in 93. After 30 years in office, she decided to step away, and a special election was run for her seat, and my assembly representative ran for it and won. Then, because of the massive Supreme Court race in 2023 in Wisconsin, to those in the audience who aren't familiar, it shattered every record across the country, $50 million spent on the Supreme Court race, because fair maps were on the line in Wisconsin. Wisconsin quite famously had some of the most gerrymandered maps in the entire country. And because of that, we finally had fairer maps for this cycle. And that allowed for finally competitive races in districts that have not been competitive for decades and decades and decades now. So I firmly believe, democracy is a participation sport. It requires everybody to do their job. It thrives when we have options and opportunity. The only thing worse than a two-party system is a one-party system, right? So we needed to have somebody on the ballot just to give members of our community the knowledge that they had a choice, so that these incumbent candidates couldn't simply rest on their laurels and get reelected cycle after cycle after cycle. So if nobody else stepped up, I just kind of determined I would have to be the one to do so. Sometimes, if you want to be the change that you want to see in the world, you got to be the one to do it yourself.
You said nobody else was stepping up to do it. What was on the back end of your campaign? When you decided you wanted to do it, who were the people? What were the resources behind you?
I've been engaged in local politics now for years and years and years, assisting with local candidates, particularly with like school board races and the not very sexy races that don't get a lot of coverage. But I have been on the senior leadership team for the assembly candidates the last 2 cycles, as well as the state senate cycle. So I am pretty well versed with a lot of the individuals who do volunteer a lot of their time and effort around electoral politics, at least within my community. And that infrastructure is massively important. In my race in particular, it was more just that we needed someone local who has already participated in election cycles. They don't need to reinvent the wheel for the first time. They have some semblance of an understanding of how to run a campaign. My district is very conservative. I was very well aware of what I was walking into. I knew the odds of victory were, frankly, very slim. But at the same time, we're still offering some opportunity, some other option to the status quo, to the established candidates who have been in office for decades and decades and decades in these communities. We're giving the voters something else to consider.
But then there are examples of candidates who seemingly break through as notable because they're an outsider or young or working class, running an authentic campaign funded through many small donations. Eric Hansen and I spoke about AOC as one example, and he made the point that there was an infrastructure already in place, getting ready for the right candidate.
No, and that's imperative across the country in any race. It's the same purpose that I had with my run, was to kind of build this infrastructure so that the future candidates of tomorrow, particularly young candidates, have an easier opportunity to step up and run. Because I think a lot of candidates, it's intimidating, it's scary. And if your options are, the party tells you, which is what happened to me a few years ago, when I expressed interest in running, I said, I'm a young candidate. I'm well connected to the area. What do I do? And the first thing they say is, all right, go call everybody in your phone and ask for money. Well, that's gross.
Well, who said that to you?
Without naming names, the implication from the party structure in general, and the advice given to a young candidate that expressed interest in running was, okay, the first step in running for office is raising money. But for young candidates in particular, you talked about the infrastructure, and I do think that's even more important than the candidate itself, is having the groundwork in place, having the team of volunteers and supporters, whether it's a volunteer campaign manager, a volunteer treasurer, just somebody to help the new candidate along so that they don't have to cross every T and dot every I, so they can focus on the things that help actually win elections, which is knocking doors, talking to voters, unfortunately fundraising, unless you're me, and just try to avoid that. But that just means more time for knocking doors and all that kind of stuff. If you have the groundwork in place, it's much, much easier to convince some of these candidates that they aren't alone when they step up to run, because nobody wants to do this by themselves. That's the biggest thing I've seen with school board races in particular in my community, is because we have a team of incredible moms and parents in the community that are willing to support school board candidates. Regular folks, the 41-year-old mother of 3 who's been really involved and wants to have, because she believes in public education and she wants not only her children, but the children in her community to get the best education possible. And she's sick of a school board that continues to defer to culture war issues rather than offering the best education possible for our students. So she wants to run for school board, but she's got a full-time job. She's got kids to raise. It's not like she can dedicate 40 to 60 hours a week for this, like some wealthy retiree might be able to, who's simply in it because they want the prestige or the power that comes with an elected position. So a lot of candidates aren't doing it because they believe in the mission or the message. They're doing it because they're receiving some kind of alternative motivation, whether it's wealthy, well-connected lobbyists behind the scenes suggesting they run, or telling them, we can run a campaign for you. You just need to be the candidate to do it. Wink, wink. And I think that has kind of artificially introduced barriers to electoral politics that kind of keep the people that we should, in theory, want in a position of leadership. To use another example, I was a delegate to the 2020 National Convention, and I was involved in the process again this year. And speaking with delegates down in Chicago, the cost to go down to Chicago for a week, not just the financial cost, you're looking at thousands and thousands of dollars with the booked room rate to stay at the hotel that all the delegates are in downtown Chicago. But, who has the ability to casually take a week or two off of work on top of that, right? It's primarily wealthy, old retirees that have the kind of spare cash to drop $4,000 on a hotel in the middle of the summer, but also don't have other commitments, whether it's taking care of children or, their job itself. No, you're either self-employed or independently wealthy, or you're not going to be able to do that. And this has kind of created this tiered system within the Democratic apparatus that artificially prevents a lot of the base that our party is supposed to be made up of, young people in the working class in particular. They're not allowed to participate. Their voices are not heard.
Well, what difference does it make whether or not we have working class people running for or holding political office? Because there are certainly working class politicians or politicians from working class backgrounds who pursue and support legislation that benefits the most wealthy in the country. Mm-hmm. So what difference does it make?
I think for a lot of regular working class Americans, we've become apathetic to a system that we recognize does not exist to benefit us. It's just two different groups of rich people fighting each other to determine which rich person's policies are going to be implemented. And if we want to have the kind of working class solidarity, the kind of movement that can drive material conditions for all Americans forward, we need to have representatives who come from those same places, who speak to these same issues because they have experienced these same issues. No matter how well educated, no matter what books you read about the working class, and no matter what you're told at your fancy New England private academy, you can't understand the plight of the working class unless you've experienced it.
While William ultimately lost the state assembly seat earlier this month, he introduced me to another relative newcomer to the Wisconsin political scene. I'm talking with Angelina Cruz, public school teacher, president of Racine Educators United, and state representative-elect of Assembly District 62 of Wisconsin. Hi, Angelina.
Hi.
So did you wake up one day and think, I'm going to run for political office?
Absolutely not. I never thought to myself, running for political office is something that I want to do. I started teaching in 2003, and in 2011, the state legislature engaged in sort of this epic battle in order to pass a law called Act 10. What Act 10 is essentially is a law that strips public sector workers of their collective bargaining rights. And Act 10 was sort of this pivotal moment where I saw people outside of the public education sphere really making an effort to impact adversely my working conditions. And so that was sort of the spark that got me involved, not just politically, but really intimately at the level of my local union. And so from then, I became a building rep in my local. I then became the political action committee chairperson. And then I just sort of kept working my way up to the point at which I became elected the president of my local. This is my 9th year, which is I'm the longest sitting president of my local. I'm the first Latina to be elected to this position, and I'm the first Latina to be elected to Assembly District 62 to represent, or to the Assembly period to represent Racine.
So clearly you've held and demonstrated leadership in the union. You've been elected to and maintained the position of president. Did someone tap you on the shoulder and say, I think you should run for state assembly?
People have, over the years, strongly encouraged me to run for public office. I've always balked at the suggestion that that was something that, A, I was fit to do, or B, even were I qualified in my own assessment to do it, is that a space that I wanted to find myself in? What really changed, I would say, over the course of the past year that compelled me to consider it more seriously was the fact that the state of Wisconsin passed new maps. Here was an opportunity for us to really start shifting what things look like at the state and local levels for working class, everyday people, and to help people who look like me and who have this similar experiences and background as me understand that we do deserve to have a seat at the table, and we do deserve to have our voices heard and be part of representation at local and state levels.
According to research by Eric Hansen and Nicholas Carnes, only 1.6% of state legislators come from the working class. When we add race and gender to the analysis, the number of Black, Indigenous, other people of color, and women, the number is even smaller. How does this track with your perception and experience of politics? And did that make you more determined or give you pause in considering running?
Speaking from my own experience, I will say it is very intimidating to contemplate doing things like this because you don't see yourself reflected in spaces like this. I want to own how scary it is. It's very scary. It takes a lot of courage. I don't believe having courage is the absence of fear, right? Like, I'm very fearful, being very honest about this. I'm very fearful when I decide to do things like this. There's a level of vulnerability in being a public figure. And I think when you are from marginalized communities, and I stand at the intersection of a lot of them, whether we're talking about gender or race or class, it's a very scary thing. And oftentimes, like, I fall into the trap of feeling imposter syndrome. Like, what did I do to get to this place? And the answer is a lot of really hard work, right? It's a lot of, I work damn hard is what the answer is.
Running for office is challenging. Who did you look to as a reference point? Did you have a mentor? What support did you get?
Right. So I think by virtue of having been so involved in local and state political activism, I have a pretty extensive network of people who I consider friends at this point, and asked, what do you think about this idea? Would you support me in doing this? There was just like a lot of excitement and willingness to sort of rally around me and support me in ways that quite frankly, I wasn't super expecting. I'm friends with many of the local electeds, and having those conversations with them about what does this job actually look like? Because like, I don't know if you've seen how much a state assembly person makes in the state of Wisconsin. It's about $53,000, which like, I need to have the job that I have and then also do this. That's an extra layer of added challenge on top of like, what are my personal anxieties around this? A lot of it's financial, right? I have student loans to pay. I'm 45 years old. I did not come from generational wealth. Mm-hmm. I had to pay for college right out of the gates with undergrad, and then for my master's, and then for any continuing education courses on top of that. Like, that's money that piles up on top of my mortgage payment and my car note and my insurance bills and my medical bills. So like, that was super helpful in terms of grounding me, having those honest conversations with local electeds who have been in the assembly or serving different capacities now about what the job actually looks like and what the feasibility of it is, given my own personal realities as a working class person.
A big obstacle for working class people to run for office is money. And often candidates are chosen or recruited for public office because they have money to self-fund and social networks with a lot of money to contribute funding to a campaign. How did you navigate that part of it? What were your fundraising strategies?
That was a thing that I had extraordinary anxiety over. How am I going to run a local educators union and run a campaign concurrently and do all of the things associated with that? And very specifically, the fundraising piece of it. I think to my advantage is that I have been the local president of the teachers union. And so initially it was reaching out just one by one to people in my network about, I understand if you can't contribute a lot, but whatever you can contribute is going to add up really quickly and be extraordinarily helpful to me. And so going into the primary, I was pretty okay. Just so everybody knows, full disclosure, the one opponent that I had during this journey was a primary opponent, and he dropped out of the race maybe 2 weeks prior to the actual primary election. So I ran uncontested for this assembly seat, which is also quite extraordinary. So once that happened, I was like, oh, sigh of relief. I don't have to be so anxiety ridden about fundraising.
The last thing I want to ask you, what changes need to happen to make it possible for more working class people to hold political office?
There are so many systemic changes that need to be made in order for working class people to even like dream of running for office, because what most of us are concerned with is day-to-day survival. Like, I need to go to the doctor. Where am I going to fit that into my schedule? Will my employer give me off during the day? Well, if I can't get off during the day, I've got my kids after work. What about childcare? So there's a lot of structural things institutionally. The cards are stacked against us. As working class people, we need to act in solidarity with one another. What are ways in which we can find those people to champion these changes, rally around them, and sort of build a team that way, versus like expecting people to go it alone? Because I am not going it alone. I have people holding me up.
I asked that same question about what needs to change at the end of each conversation. Not surprisingly, Eric and William had similar answers to Angelina about the need for structural change to make it financially possible for working class people to run for and hold political office. And everyone shared a similar opinion about one thing that could profoundly change politics.
So this is the hard part because a lot of the solutions to this would actually be unconstitutional. So
let's dream big.
But we'll dream big. Let's assume that constitutional amendments are on the table. Back in the 1970s, the Supreme Court was considering congressional regulation of election spending. And what it said is basically it would be unconstitutional to restrict how much money any candidate can spend on their own election because it would violate their free speech rights. And so it overturned congressional limits on spending, and anyone who can raise money can spend as much as they want in pursuit of their own election. So a lot of those reforms that would need to happen in order to level the playing field in terms of money in politics would be unconstitutional, at least at the campaign level.
I mean, first and foremost would be overturning Citizens United. That ruling has been absolutely disastrous and has, in my opinion, completely destroyed all semblance of free and fair elections. When you equate money to free speech, you are essentially saying that the wealthy deserve more speech than the rest of us. And that's antithetical to the idea of one person, one vote.
Citizens United absolutely needs to be overturned. I don't believe that it has any place in a democratic society, however strictly you want to define whether or not we actually live and function in a democracy, right? But it has no place in any iteration of democracy.
While we don't expect an overturning of Citizens United anytime soon, we can expect more people challenging business as usual at the ballot box. Chances are the person representing you at the state or federal level was recruited to run for office, or most recently, appointed, regardless of their personal passion for politics. William and Angelina represent a shift. Their recent runs, along with Dan Osborne's headline-making Nebraska campaign, are examples of working-class people taking up space in a system with long-standing barriers to their participation. Gerrymandered maps, the expectation that someone be flush with cash flanked by wealthy donors, an insular network of politicians hand-selected by professional recruiters, and lots of time are some of the structural conditions that get in the way of working-class people launching successful campaigns for elected office. But a rejection of this status quo is inspiring a change. People are seeing that the experience, perspective, and leadership of working-class people are needed to fight and win. But it's one thing to run for office. What is it like to occupy it? That's next time on Shifting Terrain. If you like what you've heard, please follow the show and share it with people you know. Shifting Terrain was executive produced by Amanda Cowper and myself, Rachel Rybaczuk. Production consulting and audio mixing by Karen Given. Associate producer is Emilce Quiroz. Music by BlueDot Sessions. Thank you to our guests, Eric Hansen, William Walter, and Angelina Cruz. And a special thank you to Jordan Berg Powers and eMedia. See you next week.